Hey, North Park family. It is Saturday night. Last night, after the kids went to bed, I came in and ran through my sermon, and basically, it was too long. I had a lot of introduction material on the book of Exodus, and I decided to cut some of it. It was still too long, so I decided to give you a quick summary of Exodus here. And tomorrow, I'm just going to kind of dive into the book. So tomorrow we're starting a new series on Exodus. We're going to be going into chapters 1 to 15, which primarily focus on God's deliverance of the nation of Israel out of Egypt and to the promised land. Next summer, we'll look at God's holiness and provision as they wander through the wilderness. Now, before we dive into the book, here's a couple of quick notes about the book of Exodus. It's the second book of the Bible, part of the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. They're also called the books of Moses, the 5 books of Moses. He wrote all 5 of them. And it's a historical narrative. So when we read this book, we believe this is actual, real history. We don't believe it's made up stories. But more than just history, we believe that it's his story. We believe that when we read Exodus, it's actually the story of God's action, his sovereignty and action, his covenantal faithfulness, his grace, his mercy, his forgiveness, his love, and the execution of his sovereign power. So while there will be times in the story where we'll look to Moses and we'll look to the Israelites for examples, in fact, in 1 Corinthians 10, it tells us that these things are written as an example and warning for us. But if that's all we find in these stories, then ultimately we're missing the boat. Because Exodus is primarily about God, about how he acts, how he relates to us, how he is faithful, and how he provides. Now, why should we even study an Old Testament book? A lot of pastors that I deeply respect don't preach from the Old Testament. They preach everything from the New Testament, and then they go back to the Old Testament for supplemental material. Now, that's a completely fine philosophy, but I actually want to preach the whole counsel of God. And my plan is, by the time I retire at North Park, is to have preached through the entire Bible. Now, that means sometimes we're going to have to go a little faster than other times. But as we study this book of Exodus, there's a lot of really important reasons to study. First, this is the book that defined the nation of Israel. Genesis was kind of the creation of the world. Exodus is the creation of a nation, the nation of Israel. When you look at the rituals and practices and religious festivals and all the things that the nation of Israel does, they all tie back to that Exodus. And even God refers to himself as the God who brought them out of Egypt. This moment in the history of Israel is one of the most monumental and important moments that they had in their whole history. So all that to say, it's an important book for us to study. At the end of Genesis, Joseph, Jacob's favorite son, was sold into slavery by his brothers. But what they intended to harm actually was for the good, because Joseph was elevated to second in command in Egypt. And when a severe famine hit, Joseph was able to bring his whole family to Egypt to save their very lives. But Genesis ends with the death of Joseph. Now, before he dies, he says, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. Joseph knew that Egypt wasn't the final destination of the nation of Israel. And then Joseph died, and we read in Exodus 1:1, we read the word and. Now, if you open your Bible to Exodus 1:1, you might say, Phil, what are you talking about? The word and is not there. Well, in the Hebrew, the book begins with the word and. In other words, this is a continuation of the story of Genesis. It picks right up where Genesis left off. A few weeks ago, Carter and I went to a movie, and it was a great movie. And at the end, the climax of the movie, it just said, to be continued. And I was like, we both looked at each other like, you got to be kidding me. This was the best moment of the movie, and it just ends with a to be continued. Well, Genesis kind of ended like a to be continued. Joseph died. What would happen to his family? What would happen to his descendants? When would they go back to the promised land? How long would they be in Egypt? Well, if you read Genesis, you know that in the covenant with Abraham, God predicted that they would be in Egypt for 400 years, that they become estranged, that become enslaved and mistreated. But God had a plan in all that to make the nation prosperous and to have them leave with many riches. Now, Exodus 1 starts off with this: and these are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his entire family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all, and Joseph was already in Egypt. Now, when we're reading that, it's a kind of formal introduction, but it is formal because this is one of the most important historical moments in the nation of Israel. And so tomorrow, we're going to pick up in verse 5, and we're going to see what happens. Before we do that, I want to recommend, I'm going to put in the comments to this video and in the email a link to an introductory course on Exodus from the Gospel Coalition. It has videos, sermons, audio resources. It has a whole discussion about the date, when it happened, what was going on in Egypt when it happened, all that kind of stuff. And so I'll encourage you to check that out. But otherwise, I look forward to seeing you tomorrow as we dive into this wonderful book. Have a great night.